Our view of ancient history influences our lives in ways that may surprise many of us. It's not something we necessarily think about every day. Our framework, or paradigm, or big picture view of humanity's ancient history, or the ancient history of our planet. However, as the classic 1968 version of the movie Planet of the Apes, based on a book of the same name, which was published in France in 1963, illustrates, the vision of history held by the majority of the population has tremendous implications for the way we view ourselves and others, and influences virtually every aspect of the way that society is structured. In that film, we discover that Dr. Zaius knows the true history of the planet, but for reasons of control, he works very hard to keep that knowledge a secret. In the 1970s, author and independent Egyptologist John Anthony West published Serpent in the Sky, a book exploring the high wisdom of ancient Egypt and the evidence pointing to the conclusion that many aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization appear to have been inherited from some now unknown but even more ancient civilization, which clearly possessed a highly developed cultural, technical, artistic, and spiritual sophistication. In a way, this is akin to what is dramatized in the movie Planet of the Apes. But, like Dr. Zaius, the guardians of the conventional paradigm refuse to admit it, for fear that it will turn their society upside down. In the decades that followed, other researchers published books exploring the extensive evidence around the world which strongly suggests the existence of some very ancient but now forgotten civilization or civilizations predating ancient Sumer and Babylon and dynastic Egypt by several thousand years. Such assertions were dismissed by conventional scholars as impossible. They were ridiculed and labeled as pseudoscience. Conventional archaeologists and historians argued that there is simply no evidence of any advanced civilization in the period of 5000 BC or even earlier. But then, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, evidence which surfaced at Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey vindicated the arguments of John West, Robert Schoch, Graham Hancock, and others. The ruins at Göbekli Tepe show evidence of very sophisticated and beautiful stoneworking on massive standing pillars with smooth surfaces, angled corners, and artistic sculpting in high relief. Astoundingly, scientific dating of the site reveals that it goes back to at least 10,000 BC, and that it was deliberately buried, a massive task, not later than 8000 BC. This evidence overwhelmingly supports the existence of extremely sophisticated cultures at periods of unbelievable antiquity, far predating the conventional paradigm. Furthermore, other evidence discussed by Robert Schoch and Graham Hancock and others points to the conclusion that this ancient civilization or civilizations met their end rapidly due to some sort of planet-wide cataclysm, but that some remnant of their knowledge was preserved for a time and passed on in some form to the survivors of that catastrophe. After several years of study, I am convinced that the world's mythology, the myths, scriptures, and sacred stories found in virtually every culture on our planet, provide an additional source of evidence pointing to the existence of an ancient culture which predates even the earliest civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. An ancient culture of incredible spiritual knowledge and sophistication. Building on the research of others who've suggested the same thing, some of them writing in previous centuries, some of them going back to ancient times, I've found evidence that virtually all the myths, scriptures, and sacred stories from around the world are built on the same common language or system of celestial metaphor. The level of detail that's shared by the myths around the world indicates that they are all probably descended from a shared ancient system. I'd like to illustrate some of that evidence today, working with manifestations of the constellation Hercules and tracing just that specific constellation through some representative myths from around the world. Hercules is a good choice for a variety of reasons, one of which being we all know that there is a mythical character named Hercules or Heracles in ancient Greece, a character who I believe, just like all the other myths, is based upon the stars, the constellation, not the other way around. The constellation wasn't named after the hero. The hero is a manifestation of the constellation. Let's take a look at some of the evidence. Here's an ancient Greek piece of pottery showing Hercules battling a lion. Note that extended rear leg. That is a distinctive feature of the constellation Hercules. Here's another example. Hercules engaging in combat during his encounter with the Amazons. And another example, this time showing Hercules in a deep lunge with one knee actually touching the ground. Note that in this example, in addition to the distinctive extended leg and forward raised knee, we also see the distinctive club of Hercules. Here's a well-known episode in the Hercules Myth cycle in which Hercules tries to carry off the tripod from the oracle at Delphi. The oracle, which, of course, is sacred to the god Apollo. That's Apollo in pursuit of Hercules, whose extended rear leg, again, shows us exactly which constellation in the sky he represents. Note also that Hercules is holding aloft his famous club. Here's another episode from the Heracles or Hercules cycle of myths in which the hero is wrestling with a fish-tailed deity usually known by the name of Triton. Even though the hero is entangled in the serpentine coils of his opponent, we can see that the ancient artist still keeps the very same familiar outline for Hercules, corresponding to the constellation as we see it in the night sky. Here's another beautiful piece of artwork from ancient Greece depicting the same conflict between Heracles and Triton, and you can see this for yourself if you visit the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. Once again, the hero can be seen in the very same distinctive outline characteristic of the constellation Hercules in the sky, even though his form is partly obscured by the body of Triton. It's important to realize that Heracles is not the only figure in myth who's based on this constellation. Many other mythical figures are based on the same constellation of Hercules. In fact, figures based on Hercules are not always male either. For example, here is Perseus being chased by a Gorgon. And my research suggests that Medusa and the other Gorgons in ancient Greek myth are based on the same constellation Hercules. I actually believe that the part of the constellation which we usually envision as a sword can also be envisioned as wings arching over the figure of Hercules. Here are a couple other Gorgons from ancient Greek art, showing the distinctive outline now familiar to us from the constellation Hercules. Next, we'll see a figure from ancient Mesopotamia, possibly Gilgamesh, wrestling with a lion. And you'll see that ancient Mesopotamia also inherited this system of celestial metaphor. In ancient India, the god Hanuman can be definitively associated with the constellation Hercules. You can see that the upraised sword or the extended leg may play the role of the monkey tail of the monkey god Hanuman. Hanuman also wields a mace as his weapon. That's a strong clue that we're dealing with a manifestation of the constellation Hercules. And the traditional Maori haka also appears to incorporate distinctive aspects from the constellation Hercules and the powerful deities that are associated with that constellation. Note the extremely wide eyes and extended tongue in some of the facial expressions that are part of the haka, nearly identical to the staring eyes and extended tongue depicted in some ancient Greek vase paintings of the Gorgons shown earlier, who are also Hercules figures. The author and researcher Martin Dutre of New Zealand has pointed out similarities of the Maori haka to aspects typical to the god Bes of ancient Egypt, shown here. And again, square-shaped beard, almost appearing to be a serpent beard, like the square-shaped heads of the Gorgons, shown on some depictions of Medusa and the Gorgons, as Martin Dutre also points out. This is probably because of the shape of the constellation Hercules itself and the very square head of that constellation in the sky. Now, importantly, the stories that we know of as the Old and New Testaments of the Bible can also be shown to be built on this exact same system of celestial metaphor. Here's a painting of Moses rescuing the daughters of Jethro at the well. Here's David slaying the giant Goliath with the giant's own sword. And in the stories of what is known as the New Testament, here's the angel Gabriel. Remember that we said that the sword arching over Hercules can be envisioned as a pair of wings arching over the figure that is playing the constellation Hercules in the myth. Same scene from the very early part of the 1300s. And here's another example, a beautiful painting by Botticelli from the early 1500s or the second half of the 1400s. It should be pointed out that the correspondence to the heavenly figures can actually be shown to be present in the words and actions found in the texts themselves, in the stories. This correspondence is not just found in the visual artwork. The stories themselves are based on the constellations in the sky. In this scene, the Virgin Mary corresponds to the constellation Virgo, nearby to Hercules in the sky. This ancient system is actually incredibly sophisticated, using specific constellations to point to different places within the heavenly cycles in order to convey knowledge about different aspects of our own spiritual journey. This fact that all the myths point to some common ancient source should actually be seen as uniting humanity. I also believe that the esoteric message contained in the myths is intended to empower and uplift men and women. I further believe that when we understand the language they're using, a celestial language of metaphor, then we will be better able to hear that message that this ancient inheritance is trying to convey. In the early 1950s, the author H.A. Rey suggested a, quote, new way of outlining the stars, the constellations, which, although he didn't say it, actually appears to correspond to the ancient system used in all the world's myths. We've been using his suggested outline for the constellation Hercules. The outline for Hercules that's still presented today in many books and websites is shown here. Not very useful for stargazing and definitely not very helpful for perceiving the ancient connections that we've been observing in this discussion. Just so happens that I was raised on the star books of H.A. Rey, as well as on the wonderful books of mythology written and illustrated by Ingrid and Edgar Perrin de Allaire and published in the 1960s. I'm currently working on a multi-volume series of books outlining this ancient system and showing that it is in fact in operation in the myths from every part of the world. It should be almost incontrovertible at this point that the conventional understanding of the ancient history of humanity and of our planet is incorrect, the conventional understanding. This knowledge actually changes not just everything we know about the past, but about the present as well, and should even be seen as having profound implications for our vision of the future. Our view of ancient history really does influence our lives in surprising ways.